There was a time when Bramall Lane sang Eddie Colquhoun's name with pride, not because he chased fame, not because football made him a celebrity, but because he represented something old football once respected: strength, leadership, fearlessness. Eddie Colquhoun was the hard Scottish captain at the heart of Sheffield United's old fighting side, behind Tony Curry, behind Alan Woodward, behind one of the club's most loved generations. Old supporters still talk about him the same way: hard as nails, no nonsense, a proper captain. One old Sheffield United chant captured exactly what he meant. We ain't got a barrel of money, but we've got Woodward and Curry, and with Eddie Colquhoun, promotion is soon, but football moves on fast. Too fast. Because when Eddie Colquhoun died, there was no huge national tribute, no endless television montages, no modern football audience stopping to ask who he really was. And maybe that is the saddest part. A man once sung from the terraces of Bramall Lane slowly became another forgotten name from football's harder age. This is the sad ending of Eddie Colquhoun, and what football never talks about. If you still remember that hard old football world, subscribe now, because forgotten captains like Eddie Colquhoun should never disappear quietly. Before Sheffield United made Eddie Colquhoun a captain, football gave him one of its cruelest moments. Long before the Bramall Lane chants, before promotion, before fans called him hard as nails, Eddie was fighting to build his name at West Bromwich Albion. And in 1968, he came painfully close to the biggest day of his career. West Brom were heading toward the FA Cup final. Wembley was waiting. For any footballer of that era, that was the dream. Not social media fame, not sponsorship deals, Wembley. But just before the final, everything changed. Eddie suffered a broken leg against Newcastle United, and suddenly, the biggest match of his life was gone. West Brom went on to win the FA Cup. But Eddie Colquhoun watched the moment from the outside. That stayed with people, because football can be brutal that way. One injury, one tackle, one bad moment, and history moves forward without you. Most modern fans never talk about that part of Eddie's story. They see the hard man image, the beard, the tough captain. But underneath all of that was a footballer who already understood heartbreak before Sheffield United truly knew his name. And maybe that is why Bramall Lane connected with him later, because Colquhoun did not arrive in Sheffield as a glamorous star. He arrived as a man carrying disappointment, trying to rebuild his career in football's hardest years. When Eddie Colquhoun arrived at Sheffield United in 1968, he did not arrive as a superstar. There were no massive headlines, no cameras following him across the country. To many outside Sheffield, he was simply another defender trying to rebuild his career after injury. But Bramall Lane saw something else. They saw toughness, real toughness, the kind old football respected immediately. Eddie did not need tricks. He did not need flashy interviews. He defended hard, led loudly, and played every match like football was personal. Very quickly, Sheffield United supporters began trusting him, then depending on him, and eventually they began building the side around him. That is what made Eddie different. He was not just part of the team, he became the spine of it. As the years passed, Sheffield United started rising again. Promotion arrived in 1971. The club returned to the First Division, and standing at the centre of everything was Eddie, the hard Scottish centre-half who once thought football had left him behind. Now Bramall Lane had given him a second life, and alongside names like Tony Curry, Alan Woodward, Len Badger, Bill Durden and Trevor Hockey, Eddie became part of one of Sheffield United's most remembered generations. Not the most glamorous, not the richest, but one supporters never forgot, because every great old football side needed balance. Curry gave them imagination, Woodward gave them power, but Eddie gave them steel. By the early 1970s, Sheffield United supporters had started believing again. Not because the club was rich, and not because football experts expected greatness, but because something inside Bramall Lane felt alive. Tony Curry could glide past players like the ball belonged to him. Alan Woodward could hit a shot hard enough to shake a stadium. Trevor Hockey brought madness, energy, fight. But Eddie brought calm, the kind of calm only hard captains carry. When matches became ugly, supporters looked toward him. And in Old English football, that mattered more than fancy football. Crowds trusted players who looked willing to bleed for the shirt. Eddie looked exactly like that. The beard, the heavy tackles, the battered body. He looked less like a celebrity footballer and more like a man dragged straight out of Sheffield steel. That is why the supporters sang his name. Not quietly either, loudly, proudly, because it belonged to a different football world. A world before agents, before branding, before polished interviews. And somewhere inside that noise, Eddie Colquhoun became more than a defender. He became part of Sheffield United's identity. That is why his ending feels so sad today. Because once the singing stopped, football slowly stopped mentioning him too. Old Sheffield United supporters still describe Eddie in the same way. Hard as nails. One fan later said he looked carved out of Scottish granite. And honestly, that suited him perfectly. The beard, the stare, the heavy tackles. Eddie Colquhoun looked built for football's hardest era. But what made supporters love him was not just aggression, it was honesty. He played like football mattered. No pretending, no glamour, no fear. Stories from those years still survive. Tunnel fights, violent cup ties, crowds roaring after brutal tackles. One old fan memory even recalled a heated clash with Norwich striker Phil Boyer during a bad-tempered match at Bramall Lane. That was old football, mud, noise, anger, and Eddie fit that world perfectly. But players from that era rarely protected their legacy. They simply played and slowly disappeared from football's memory once the game moved on. Maybe that is why older Sheffield United supporters still speak about Eddie differently today. Because football no longer produces captains like him. Eddie Colquhoun's performances for Sheffield United eventually earned him recognition with Scotland. For any Scottish player of that era, that meant something. It was pride, respect, proof that your football mattered beyond your club. Eddie went on to win international caps for Scotland during the early 1970s. But unlike some names from that period, his international career never became legendary. There were no giant documentaries, no endless replays, no famous football mythology built around him. And maybe the hardest moment came in 1973. Scotland suffered a brutal 5-0 defeat against England at Hampden Park. For Eddie, it became one of the final major memories of his Scotland career. That hurt, because football can be cruel with timing. One difficult night can stay attached to a player for years, especially in Britain, especially in that era. And while Scotland eventually moved toward the 1974 World Cup, Eddie Colquhoun slowly disappeared from the international picture. No drama, no scandal, just silence. The same silence that later followed so many old footballers once the game moved on without them. For a while, it felt like Sheffield United were building something that could last. Promotion in 1971. Big First Division afternoons at Bramall Lane. Tony Curry creating magic. Alan Woodward frightening goalkeepers. And Eddie leading everything from the back. But old football changed quickly. The same crowds that once believed anything was possible slowly watched the momentum disappear. By the mid-1970s, the side that had carried so much pride started fading. Results became harder. The energy changed. And eventually, Sheffield United were relegated again. That hurt players like Eddie more than most, because he was not a passing superstar. He had given nearly a decade of his life to the club. Hundreds of appearances, battles, cold nights, promotion fights, and suddenly, the great years were becoming memories. That is one of the saddest truths about old football. A player can become part of a club's identity, and still slowly watch everything around him disappear anyway. By the end of the 1970s, Eddie's football life was winding down. The beard was greyer. The body had taken years of punishment, and the old First Division world he belonged to was changing fast. Football was becoming different, cleaner, more commercial, more interested in personalities than hard captains. Men like Eddie rarely fitted that new world, because he was never built to sell himself. He belonged to the age of muddy pitches, heavy tackles, and packed terraces, breathing cigarette smoke into cold air. An age where captains earned respect through pain, not publicity. And once those years disappeared, so did much of the attention around him. Younger supporters slowly stopped hearing his name. New generations arrived, new heroes arrived. And one of Sheffield United's hardest captains became part of old football memory instead of modern football conversation. That is why older Blades supporters still speak about him with emotion today, because they remember something modern football cannot recreate. A defender who looked ordinary to outsiders, but meant everything to the people standing behind the goal at Bramall Lane. And as time passed, that gap between what Eddie meant to Sheffield and how little wider football spoke about him only became larger. By the final years of Eddie's life, football barely resembled the game he once fought through every weekend. The cold terraces were disappearing, the old hard men were fading away, and the generation that understood players like Eddie was growing older with every passing year. He never chased attention after retirement, never tried turning himself into a media personality. There were no loud interviews, no endless television appearances. He simply drifted quietly away from the centre of football life. And maybe that made the sadness even heavier, because behind the beard, the tackles, and the fearsome image, there was also a husband, a father, and later grandfather whose football connection continued through Ben Wiles. But even that family link never truly brought Eddie back into the spotlight modern football reserves for bigger names. Instead, his memory are survived in smaller places. Old Sheffield United supporters sharing stories online, fans remembering how intimidating he looked walking onto the pitch, others remembering the opposite, a calm and approachable man away from football. One supporter described him as looking carved out of Scottish granite. Another simply called him a proper blade. And honestly, that may describe Eddie Colquhoun better than anything else ever could. Not a celebrity, not a football brand, just a proper blade. A defender who gave Sheffield United nearly a decade of his life without demanding fame in return. That is why his underrated legacy still carries emotion today. Because older supporters understand something modern football often forgets. The loudest players are not always the most important ones. Sometimes the men who matter most are the ones who quietly carried clubs through their hardest years, then slowly disappeared while football chased newer heroes, and somewhere inside Bramall Lane's old memories, Eddie Colquhoun still remains part of that harder football world supporters never fully let go of. If you still believe football should remember captains like Eddie Colquhoun, subscribe now, because once the people who remember these players are gone, their stories disappear with them.